Welcome to Session 5 of Tapestry Teacher Training. This session is entitled Teaching Literature at All Levels. I will be your host today, Christy Somerville. Yes, I am a Somerville. I'm Marcia Somerville's daughter, but you probably know me better as the author of the Rhetoric literature program for Tapestry of Grace. My goal for today is to orient you to the vision of and also the basic or underlying structure of the Tapestry literature program. I'm not going to get into detail about a lot of things. If you want more detail, I would really encourage you to look at the first 3 sections of Poetics, which you can find on Loom, or also at the Teaching Rhetoric Literature document that's on Loom that has a lot of helpful details and information that explains each part of the Rhetoric Literature program and so on. I am not only going to be talking about Rhetoric Literature, I will be discussing the lower levels, but because Tapestry is kind of a top-down program where we look first at the end goal where we want to get, and then how we scale that back to bring children up to it, sort of like an on-ramp onto rhetoric over the course of their younger years, I am going to be focusing on the end goal and how we get there. With that in mind, being a literary person, naturally I have a controlling metaphor for this talk, and that is the ship and the sea, and the long journey that's called the next 9 months of your life with your children in Tapestry. There was a man named John Masefield, who is a poet laureate of England, actually. So as I would say to my students, he was the main poet dude for that country from 1930 to 1967. And he wrote a poem that I love. I ran across it in my childhood, actually. It's called Sea Fever. It may be familiar to you. It goes, he says, "I must go down to the sea again, to the lonely sea in the sky, and all I ask is a tall ship and a star to steer her by. And the wheels kick, and the wind's song, and the white sails shaking, and a gray mist on the sea's face, and a gray dawn breaking." And he's talking in this poem about his love for the sea, and just, I have to go down to the sea again, and all I ask is a tall ship and a star to steer her by. And this is really what I want to try to envision you for. What we want to give you is a tall ship, that is the Tapestry Literature program, and sort of a star to steer by. What is your goal? What does a graduating high school student really need to know about literature in order to fulfill the standards of school boards, of his parents' hearts for him, your heart for him, and his really, ultimately, his identity as a worshiper of God who is seeking to live a gospel-centered life in a fallen world? What does he need to know regardless of whether he's going to college or just trying to get an education, form his soul and shape a worldview, which is, by the way, I think the far more important goal by the end of high school. Where is the steady North Star? What should he have? What should your student have in his head and in his heart when his diploma is in his hand? Well, this is the first section. We're going to talk about goals, big goals, major goals, and we're going to split that into 3 categories. Number 1, what the school boards require, which is the least of our concerns. I know it seems like the most of your concerns, but believe me, it's the least. And the second one is what your heart for your student is as a parent. And the third one is what we really want for your student as a follower of Christ. So let's start with the school boards. Number 1, school boards. Now, the requirements of school boards are actually pretty simple, and they vary from state to state, from region to region, but in the end, you boil it down, they really want 4 things. Number 1, they want your student to read books. I've known classes where you only read 2 or 3 books or 5 books in the course of an entire year, and those are considered classes. So it's not really about the number of books. If you're reading anywhere from 5 to 50 books that are considered great works of literature, then that would be pretty much what's required. So that's the reading books. Second one, they want your student to think about books, preferably in the form of literary exercises and classroom discussions. So there's that. Number 3, they want your student to write about books. They want him to be able to feed back what he's thought about books in his own written words. And then finally, number 4, pretty much all of them require that your student be tested on his knowledge of books and his skills with regard to books. Now, this may sound pretty broad, and that's because it is broad. And that's really, honestly, all that they require. That's all that they're really looking for. Now, if your student has in a given year read 5 to 50 works of great literature and has acquired or significantly refined the skills that enable him to think, speak, and write about those works in a way that the rest of the world accepts as reasonable, or ideally knowledgeable, insightful, and eloquent, then he really has succeeded in the eyes of most, if not all, school boards. So that should be comforting to you. In point of fact, the requirements of the school boards are actually a lot lower and a lot more worldly than your own heart for your student. You want more than just a list of books he's read, exercises completed, papers written, tests with high scores. You want, well, one thing you want is for him to enjoy his studies. I think all teachers want that. But then in addition, even more than that, you want him to grow in his appreciation of God, in his Christian witness as a result of these studies. The Westminster Catechism asks, what is the chief end of man? And the answer to that question in the Catechism is to glorify God and enjoy Him forever. I do believe that literature can be one means of glorifying God and enjoying Him forever. And I think that as Christian parents, I think what you want most, regardless of college, regardless of academic concerns, is for your child to read literature because it's a gift from God that is, or at least can be, good for his soul. If that is your heart, then I believe that the lines really have fallen for you in pleasant places. All these things are within the reach of the Christian student, not just academic success, not even just enjoyment, but also the ability to glorify and enjoy God more as a result of his literary studies. So we've talked about what school boards require, and we've talked about what your heart is for your student. Now let's talk a little bit about what we think is good for a Christian to have. Why would we choose to read the great works of secular and sacred literature in the course of 4 years? Why would we think that that would be valuable for him? Let me start with the easy part. We believe it's good for a Christian student to have a knowledge of the great Christian literature, which is part of his own heritage, beginning with the Bible, which is just a work of extraordinary artistry and is richly rewarding his literary study, and then continuing through the centuries of Christian poets and storytellers. Study of Christian literature and history is an opportunity to view the central event in human history, which is Christ's death on the cross, through the passionate and artistically exquisite works of Christians throughout the ages. Let me just pause for a second here and note, it is amazing to study the Bible as literature. Whenever my students ask me, why do we have to do this? I say to them, all right, if for no other reason, it would be worth it for you to learn all these vocabulary terms and all these tools of literary analysis just so that you could appreciate the Bible more. Because even unbelievers recognize that the Bible is exquisite. I think the book of Ecclesiastes has been called the most beautiful thing ever written. And being able to come to the Bible and see this isn't just the truth, as if that weren't enough, but it is also beautiful. And I just love it that God bothered to craft the Bible in such a way as to make it beautiful. It's amazing to me that he uses patterns and balance and contrast and symmetry and all these different artistic techniques to make the Bible so memorable, so readable. It flows off the page, it's easy to memorize, and it's also just rich. It's studded all over with these jewels of imagery. The stories are crisp and vivid, and they leap right off the page. And it's amazing to me as a student of literature to have the tools to appreciate that more. So whenever my students say to me, why do we have to study this stuff? Why do we have to learn all these literary analysis terms and tools? I say to them, look, if for nothing else, you will be able to be more in love with Scripture as a result of being able to appreciate what it has to offer that you don't even see yet. I love to be able to tell them that. Okay, so that's the easy part, telling Christian students that they should study Christian literature and why it's so cool. More difficult is to explain why we would want them to have a working knowledge of great secular literature, which is also part of a great book's curriculum. One of the things I like to think of it this way is to read the great literary works of history is like wandering around inside the heart of the world. To understand these books is to understand important pieces of how the world has felt, thought, and believed since words began to be written. In short, you could say that to read secular literature as part of the great books is to receive more insights into humanity. Now, of course, a host of objections immediately arise. Are all these insights true and helpful? What are the worldviews, especially the unbiblical worldviews from which some of these books are written? How are these going to affect my student? Will my student be able to discern? Will there be really any benefit? And what about all the sexual stuff and explicit language and other things that are contained in these books? These are all good questions. And, hence the need for training and evaluation and right enjoyment of secular literature. I think I would really like to send you to a special section of Poetics, which again is on the Loom, that we've written just to deal with this topic. It is in section 1 of Poetics. I believe it's subsection F, and it's called Including Athens, Why Study Secular Literature. So you can go there for more comments on that and more detailed explanation. But are the insights, which are not always true and helpful, are they worthwhile to know as a means of understanding the world and learning how to live biblically in it? And yes, frankly, we believe that there are. Also, though it's no substitute for encountering real people in real life, I do think that literature can provide a sampling of human beliefs about what's real, what's right and wrong, what's valuable, which are often easier to understand and biblically evaluate if you meet them in literature first, before you meet them in life. Now, I have to be careful when I say that because, of course, there are pros and cons to both. You can meet an angry character in a novel and have to deal with your own emotions with regard to that character and deal with who they are and how in the world would you love such a person. But it's kind of a theoretical exercise. You aren't called upon to actually go out and love that angry character in the book. On the other hand, in real life, I have a friend who has a next-door neighbor, an older lady who is not careful in her language and can be very angry. And this neighbor cussed out my friend's little girl, her little 10 or 11-year-old girl, just because the little girl let the dog run into the neighbor's yard. And here this neighbor is just giving her an earful. And that's hard. And my friend has to instruct her 3 children in how to deal with this neighbor and how to love this neighbor in spite of the foul language, the anger, and the verbal abuse. So in books, it's more theoretical. So, there are benefits to both sides, but I don't think that literature is a replacement for life because we need to be doers of the word and not just hearers. So I don't ever tell my students that reading about hard things in a book is a substitute for going out and actually loving your neighbor. But on the other hand, is a really good training ground to understand your neighbor sometimes, or another person's worldview or another person's sin nature, before you then have to go out there and try to love them. So anyway, there are a lot of different reasons I could give for the value and importance of the study of secular literature. I've touched on a few of them here, and I'm just going to send you to Poetics for the rest. But this is a Great Books program, and a Great Books program does include both the great secular literature and the great Christian literature of the ages. So now we're done with our section on major goals, and we're going to move on to consider how the Tapestry program is designed to meet those goals. Now, the Tapestry program, as we've been discussing, is a Great Books program. And for us, the great books are kind of grist for the mill, if you will. What we're really trying to teach here are the tools of learning. Now, in order to learn how to use tools, obviously you have to have something to practice on. Just as you may give your little 5-year-old a little piece of dough to turn into a cake, or you may give a little boy, a hammer and a couple of nails to pound into wood. So similarly, we use the great books as the material on which students work as they learn how to acquire the skills of understanding literature and then evaluating literature from a biblical perspective, and then finally just being able to enjoy everything that it has to offer. And this is what we call the understand, evaluate, enjoy method. These are the tools that we're trying to teach. Now, in order to genuinely understand literature, we want our students to be able to identify and describe elements in literature, things like plot, settings, characters, themes, with clarity and accuracy. That's really the work of it, if you will. That's where vocabulary terms come in. That's where, character charts and experiment in living graphs and how does this happen, how does that happen, really breaking apart the artistic work as a whole and trying to understand it and trying to understand the elements that go into it. That is understanding. And it's good hard work. It's definitely the part that the kids complain about the most. But it's also the part that really helps them. If you think about studying a foreign language, you always have to learn the grammar of the foreign language. You have to learn its verbs and tenses and conjugations. Or if you're in math or in science, you have to learn how the equations work. Or in science, you'd have to learn the periodic table of the elements. You have to learn these things in order to be able to unpack what's going on. And although students, object to having to work hard, just like the rest of us, no discipline at the time seems pleasant but rather painful, nevertheless, it is very rewarding to them over time. A lot of people ask me, isn't all this literary terminology and all these tools, isn't this like a college level thing? And the answer to that is honestly no. I didn't do any of that stuff in college. In college, we mostly sat around and talked about, what we thought was going on in the literature, and we just kind of freewheeled a lot, which I thought was kind of unfortunate. I went to a very good school. It was an excellent college. It was a private school and everything, and I had great teachers, but we just never seemed to learn how to really take literature apart as an art form and understand it the way you would do with music or ballet or painting or anything else. So I actually thought that was kind of unfortunate, and it always makes me laugh a little bit when people say to me, well, isn't this really in-depth and really college level? And I'm like, no, actually, this is what I wish we'd done in college. And I do find over and over again, not only myself, but other teachers and other moms who I talk to, that really the kids get into it over time. As they acquire the skills, they really get into it. And then, obviously, it's very rewarding for them. But I don't think it's any more a college-level thing for them to do than it would be for them, like I said, to memorize the periodic table of the elements or learn the quadratic equation or do any of the other things that they are required to do in high school. So I think this is really a lot more normal than people realize. But anyway, that's my pitch for that. But I do think that understanding what's going on in a work of literature is an absolute necessary part of the process. So that's why I put it first, the understand, evaluate, enjoy. Because also you can't evaluate what you haven't understood. That's like trying to decide or pronounce on a book that you haven't read at all. And it's hard to enjoy, or it's hard to enjoy as keenly and with as much appreciation, something that you haven't understood and studied. So that's why understanding is a key part of this. Understanding is also where we get to what I like to call the three-ring circus. I often tell moms when I'm trying to explain to them how to teach, I say, well, if you think about it, because we're doing literature throughout history, you don't just need to read the work of literature in order to understand it. You also need to have some information about the historical background, and especially the historical worldview's background. So if you're reading the Iliad or the Odyssey and don't know anything about ancient Greek polytheism, which just means that they worshipped a lot of different gods and had a lot of different stories about those gods, then, Hera and Juno and Athena and all these gods and goddesses keep showing up in the Odyssey, and you're like, what in the world is going on here? So you need historical background. And you also need to know, I feel, what the author, what his worldview is and what he believed and what his life was like. And unfortunately, we don't have that information for the Odyssey. People often say that the Odyssey was written by Homer or by another man of the same name, which is a joke because we know so little about Homer, we really only know his name. There's a lot of speculation, but, we just don't know. As you move on through history, though, you start to know a lot about various authors. We know a lot about John Bunyan, who wrote Pilgrim's Progress, or F. Scott Fitzgerald, who wrote The Great Gatsby, or, a lot of different things. And it's amazing to me to see over and over again how much their various life experiences and their own worldviews really affected what they wrote, which is about what you'd expect. So what I like to call a three-ring circus is there's the ring of the book itself, and then there's the ring of the historical and worldview's background of the book, kind of what's going on in the place and time in which it was written. And then the third ring is the author and his particular unique individual worldview and life experiences, which also contribute to the book. And this, by the way, flies in the face of a lot of current literary practice. People nowadays, in theory, a lot of college professors will tell you that what the author was trying to say in his own book really doesn't matter. What matters is your interpretation of it. which is a sad thing, and it's a sort of a product of the times. But in practice, it's really funny. I ask some of my former students from time to time right now in college, I say, okay, they teach you that in theory, but in practice, how does it work out? And they go, oh, well, in practice, in class, the teachers and the students are always talking about what the author meant. So they talk about the author's intentions not meaning much, but actually everybody does care about what the author meant to say, because after all, we're reading his book, and it's clear that he had something to say or he wouldn't have written it. So that's sort of why we really focus also on the third ring. We don't talk about the book as if it's completely dependent on what the author meant. After we finish trying to understand what the author was saying, we'll often pull back and say, all right, so that's what he was saying. But now from a biblical perspective, how do we understand this? So it's not like the author is God, and whatever he says goes. But we do feel it's important to know what the author intended and what he was going for originally. So all this is part of understanding the three-ring circus of the book itself, the historical and worldview's context, and then the author's life and his own personal worldview context. So I call that the three-ring circus. So that's all part of understanding as well. Now, in order to biblically evaluate a work of literature, we do first have to understand it, and we have to understand what it itself is meant to say. But that doesn't just mean we take its word for it. A good example would be Les Miserables. In this story by Victor Hugo, you have something that seems like its themes are really close to the gospel. You have a thief who is redeemed by a bishop, and the bishop shows him mercy, and the thief repents as a result of that mercy, and then the thief spends the rest of his life loving other people self-sacrificially and growing in humility, which is all very beautiful, and there's a ton that we can get out of that and appreciate as Christians. But one thing that I think is easy to mistake is something I certainly mistook the first 2 or 3 times I read the book, and only noticed the last time I was going through it to write about it for Tapestry, is that the message that Victor Hugo is presenting is actually either a partial gospel or a false gospel from a biblical perspective. At best, it's a partial gospel, because what he's consistently saying throughout the book is consistently demonstrating the redemptive power of human love, which is wonderful. But even with the bishop says to Valjean, I have purchased your soul for God, essentially through the mercy and kindness that he shows him. And Valjean I think the musical that was written based on the book puts what the book is trying to say here really well. It says, to love another person is to see the face of God, which is really, I think, a really good summation of what you see going on in the book. But the problem is, of course, that is not the gospel. The gospel is not to love another person is to see the face of God, but rather to be loved by God, to be redeemed by Christ through his self-sacrificial love, through his redemptive work on the cross. That is what gives us hope that we will see the face of God. We aren't saved by our love for other people. They aren't saved by our love for them. We are all saved by God's love for us, and it is God's love for us that gives us even the ability to love other people. As it says in 1 John, we love because he first loved us, he being God. So, at best, I would say, Les Mis presents this partial gospel which strongly emphasizes human love, but fails to place equal or primary emphasis on the love of God, which is where the primary emphasis really should be. I think at worst, it's a false gospel. It gives you the impression that human love will save you, which is not the case. Only God's love saves. So, it's difficult because I grew up, well-taught Christian student and thought Les Mis has hit it on the head. Les Mis is exactly right. And then imagine what a shock it was to me to come back to it and say, no, actually, Les Mis has not nailed it right on the head. Les Mis has a lot of wonderful things to say, but Les Mis is missing some really important elements and may even be distorting what is the true gospel. So we do a lot of that kind of evaluation in Tapestry. And what's really cool, what I absolutely love, is to see the kids taking those skills outside of literature class and starting to apply them to life. I will never forget. It was so sweet. I was living with a family, and their 17-year-old daughter was my student, and I had been teaching her for about a year. She was part of a co-op class that I taught, so she was one of 12 students who I taught, and she was a huge Disney fan. She loved Disney. And there had just come out some new Disney movie, and she watched it, and she came to my room a day later, and she flopped on my bed, and she said to me, "Christy, you've ruined me." And I said, "Did I really?" I said, "What did I do to you?" And she goes, "Well, you taught me all about worldviews, and you taught me about people's beliefs about reality and morality and values and their experiments in living." And she goes, "I just couldn't enjoy this movie that I was watching last night because I saw that the main character's values and what he believed about reality were all wrong. And that his experiment in living, even though it turned out well in the movie, wouldn't have turned out well in real life and was dumb." And she goes, I can't enjoy this anymore." And I was, of course, thrilled because I saw that what had happened to her was that she had begun to cross-apply what she was learning about discernment in literature class to even her entertainment, her movie choices. And she isn't the only student who's told me this. I now have had 3 or 4 students over the last 2 years come to me and say something similar, usually about movies or video games or books that they're watching or reading or otherwise experiencing. So I really love that. I love to see the students seeing that these tools of learning, these tools of discernment, these tools of understanding and biblically evaluating are then to be cross-applied to their entertainment choices and to the things that they do for pleasure. And yes, these things do destroy their enjoyment in poor entertainment. They do destroy some of their enjoyment in poor movies and poor books. But I'm really happy about that because that means that they'll go out and find things that are really worth enjoying and enjoy them for the right reasons. So I think that's pretty cool. So evaluation is a major part of what we do, biblical evaluation. And that does require us to first understand, but then after we understand, we do pull back and evaluate. And then what you finally wind up with is once you've understood and once you've evaluated, then you're in a really good position to just enjoy because you know what there is to enjoy and what there isn't to enjoy. In other words, you won't wind up enjoying the wrong things. You won't wind up enjoying falsehoods thinking that they're truths. And you will have really done the work of understanding the artistry, the settings, plot, characters, how beautifully it's all constructed, how well it's put together, and then you really have the keenest possible appreciation for both what the story is saying and the artistic form, the shape, the how it's saying it. So we're clear then that understand, evaluate, and enjoy are the tools of learning that we're trying to teach your students and that we're using great books as the material for them to practice on. Okay. One other thing I want to say about that, though, is the distinction, very valuable distinction that students learn to make between content of books and artistic form of books. I want to unpack this a little bit because this is another of those major things that we're trying to do in this program. The content of a book, I think I touched on this slightly before, is what the book says, its message, its themes, if you will. The form of the book, artistic form, is things like, so how does the story of the thief, whose name is Valjean in Les Miserables, help to get across the idea that human love will really save you? Or if you have a character who says, "I am perfectly righteous," and then he's standing in hell. Well, then you automatically understand by the setting and what the character is saying that he's actually thinks he's righteous, but he's not righteous at all. He's standing in hell. And that would be contrast, dramatic irony, various other terms like that. So that would be the artistic form, having a character sitting there saying, "I am righteous while standing in hell." And that would be the message of that you would get through that would be, oh, actually, he's not righteous at all. Another nicer example, one of my favorites, is in the Psalms. I believe Psalm 130. There's a phrase that goes, "We long for God." I'm paraphrasing a little bit here. "We long for God. My soul longs for God more than watchmen for the morning." I love that because it takes this content, this theme of what it's like to long for God, and then it puts it in this artistic word picture, this artistic form of, you got these guys who've been up all night, they're cold, they're hungry, they want their breakfast, they want their coffee, they've been staying up all night. I'm sure some of you moms who have nursing children know what this is like, and they're just waiting for morning. Just those simple, elemental things like heat and light. And they just want it to come. They want to see it. They want to be able to begin their day as day and not night anymore. And I love that word picture. I love it because so often in my life, I sit there and think, to see God's face. That would be the sun for me. That would be morning. To leave behind my own sin, my condemnation, my anxiety about my students, and are they going to get this, and is it going to be all right, and am I ruining them? To just leave all that behind, that long, weary night of watching, and just see the sunrise, just to be in God's presence, to experience the warmth and light of that. So I love this image because it so beautifully, so vividly conveys the meaning of what it's like for your soul to long for God. And that is what we call, it's a very old artistic principle called meaning through form. The idea that you take a meaning, you take something you're trying to communicate, and you embody it in an artistic form that gets it across. In this case, this word picture is the artistic form that gets across what it means to long for God. So I love that. And content and form are two of the things that we're continually looking at in Tapestry. We have to understand both of them. We have to understand this is what the story is saying, and then this is how it's saying it, which are content, what it's saying, and form, how it's saying it. And then we have to say, okay, we have to understand how the author is getting across his meaning through this form. And then we have to step back and evaluate that. We say, okay, maybe the author is using a perfectly great artistic form, like contrast, but maybe the message that he's getting across through that contrast is terrible. Or maybe he's got a really great message, but he's doing a really poor job of it. His artistic form just doesn't communicate that very well at all. It doesn't embody that meaning very well at all. So it's one of these things where really you need to be able to separate the two, separate content and form, and evaluate them separately. And what's really neat about this is that it helps with so much secular literature. It helps both in our ability to have some appreciation for it without giving up what we believe, our biblical worldview. And it also helps in that we can talk to unbelievers about it and express appreciation for certain parts of it. And then that makes them much more willing to listen to us when we say, I really appreciate the artistry with which this was written, how well it was written. But I gotta say, the content, I'm thinking in particular now of The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald, which many of you may have studied in high school. This book is exquisitely written. There are images in there that I love. There's symbolism, there's stuff like, I love this one part where Fitzgerald says, I think he says something, and I'm paraphrasing again here, but he says, the taxis are hopping around like yellow grasshoppers to pick people up from the station. Or he talks about a woman being like an angry diamond, or, just these various images that are very vivid and very, very well done. So he's a great writer, no question about that. But the whole story is about this fellow named Gatsby, who is the hero and who is in love with another man's wife. And although Fitzgerald does to a certain degree say that's not a good thing in the book, he also to a certain degree, holds it up as valuable. He says, their great love for each other, and this is, to a certain degree, he praises it. And obviously as a Christian I have a problem with that. But as I was teaching my students, we were doing year 4 last year, to be able to separate the two, to be able to say, on the one hand, we can appreciate how artistically he is writing, but on the other hand, we have to say what he's saying is not right, is not biblical. that's just such a helpful distinction, because it means that I could go to an unbeliever. Let's say I'm a high school student now, I'm graduated Tapestry, I'm in college, and my professor says, here's Gatsby, and he loves this woman, and it's all so wonderful, and don't you agree? And you can raise your hand and you can say, well, sir, I think that the way that Gatsby wrote it is absolutely amazing, but honestly, I have to disagree. I don't think that's okay. And what's neat about that is that professors respect a student who is clearly not rejecting the book just because he didn't happen to like it. A student who's able to present a balanced case where he can say, this is what I appreciate, this is where I see why people call this great art, but on the other hand, I have to say, this is what I have a problem with, is always going to receive more respect and a more willing audience from his classmates, his professors who are secular, than a student who just says, I just didn't like anything about it, and, I just hated the whole book, and by the way, it's unbiblical. It just doesn't come across sounding very good. So I find over and over again that it's also really good for the student's own humility. Students are so apt, especially at the high school level, to just reject things wholesale. I didn't like it. It was boring. It was long. It had too many words, so on and so forth. And for me, often a lot of what I do with my students is forcing them, number one, to be clear, to be specific, I'm saying, if you're not going to like it, you have to explain to me exactly why, and you have to give me reasons. And, I don't require my students to agree with me. There is such a thing as personal preference. I don't particularly care for certain writing styles, not because there's anything wrong with them, not because they're not artistic, but because I just don't really care for those patterns or those artistic techniques. And so I don't ever demand that the students like everything, but I do require them to have good reasons for not liking things, especially when it comes to content. And what I found over and over again with my students is that as I require them to understand what they're reading, and as I give them a vocabulary to talk about what they're reading, more and more and more they're able to express themselves clearly. So they'll be able to say, well, what I really didn't like about this book was the way the author used imagery to say this, or I felt that his flow and the rhythm of his writing was just annoying to my ear, or, well, this character, though the author did a good job of describing his personality, though there was good characterization, which is another literary term, I felt that the character is not someone who I could identify with or care about personally. So, it's another wonderful thing about giving the students vocabulary to talk about literature with, is that they can actually express themselves in a way that makes sense. And by the way, it looks really good in papers and on tests. So that's also a cool thing. Okay, I think we're about ready to wrap up the second section that we've had here on sort of the main approach of the Tapestry program. Understand, evaluate, enjoy, how we apply those things to content and form in general, how we study mean through form, and how we use the great books as grist for the mill to do all of these things. What I'd now like to talk about is what the title of this session was promising to be, which is teaching on all levels. Tapestry literature program is K through Mom. So we present worthy books that are widely recognized for their artistic excellence and for their important content, and we include both secular literature and Christian literature in chronological order, so year 1 ancient times to year 4 modern times, at appropriate age levels. Over the course of 12 years, students read both classics of children's literature and the great works, and they also read historical fiction, which is a nice middle ground because there aren't that many children's classics, and of course, until children are in high school at least, they're not ready for the great works. So historical fiction helps us to make connections for the students to history and also fill in with some titles that are interesting and entertaining to them, and, just fill up some of the weeks where there just aren't enough children's classics or great works to put in. So we include colorful worksheets for lower grammar and upper grammar and dialectic levels, which is kindergarten through junior high in traditional terms. And then, of course, Socratic discussion, literary analysis exercises, worldviews analysis from a biblical perspective for dialectic and rhetoric levels. And I want to say really quickly just one thing about the benefits of a K through mom approach to literary studies. One of the really neat things about the idea of bringing your kids from the lower levels all the way up into high school using the same understand, evaluate, enjoy, the same literary terminology and tools, so the same definition for character or plot or setting, or the same idea of the experiment in living. The benefit of using all these is that as your students grow up, from the very beginning, they learn these universal principles of literature, like meaning through form, consistently from the beginning, and they gradually apply them in more and more sophisticated ways to more and more complex literature. So, to give you an example, you can talk about how in the parable of the Pharisee and the tax collector, the Pharisee is arrogant towards God and says, "Thank you that I am not like other men. I'm not like that tax collector over there. I do all these good things for you, God, so you should justify me." And then the tax collector, on the other hand, won't even raise his eyes to heaven. And he says, "Lord, have mercy on me, a sinner." So even at a very young children's level, you can teach them about how, okay, this is the Pharisees' experiment in living, which is basically based on pride. And here's a tax collector's experiment in living, which is basically based on humility. And do you notice how Jesus says that the Pharisee did not go away justified, but the tax collector did in the sight of God? So that would be a very simple example where you're just showing your young child, do you see this guy did this and it didn't turn out well? And what does that tell us? His experiment, the way he was living, turned out with him not being justified before God. What was wrong with what he did? And that's at a very simple level. And then, you get all the way up the other end of the scale to the Odyssey and the Aeneid and the much more complex works, because Jesus' parables, while profound, absolutely profound and amazing, they are very simple. So that's why I give them as an example. Not to say that the Odyssey and the Iliad are better than the Bible as literature, just to say they can be more complex sometimes. So in the Odyssey or the Iliad, you'd have, this long, drawn-out experiment living of one of the heroes, like Achilles, and he does all these different things. It's much more complex. There's a lot more there to analyze. But you can still say, all right, Achilles decides to be angry at the very beginning of the story and to refuse to let anybody talk to him and refuses to humble himself. And so he goes through this whole thing, and at the end of the story, he's dead. And he has failed all of his friends because he was stubborn and because he was proud and because he wouldn't listen to them. And you say, again, was this a good idea? Well, he turns out dead, unhappy, and then dead. So that doesn't seem like a good idea. So his experiment living failed. So you see, at either end of the spectrum, from the simple story like one of Jesus' parables to a more complex story like the Iliad, you can use the same concept, say, of the experiment in living, and teach it to your children all the way as they go along. The other great thing about that is that you aren't having to learn a new system of literary analysis all the time. If you are teaching Tapestry, the same terms, the same tools will show up over and over again, year to year to year. So you won't be teaching your young children a different definition or a different tool. It may be a simpler definition. We do sometimes simplify definitions for younger students, but it will be the same basic literary concepts as you're teaching to your older students. I think that's really helpful too, because if a literary concept is complex or difficult, like if you say, I'm really not sure how to wrap my mind around dramatic irony, sometimes you'll have dramatic irony explained in a simpler way at a lower level. And then as you teach your younger child that, then you're able to say, oh, okay, I begin to get this. And then when you go to teach your child about dramatic irony at an upper level, you'll be more comfortable with it. So at the very least, you'll have familiarity, and so will your students. There'll be this sense of, all right, I'm graduating to more and more and more difficult books as I go along, but I'm always bringing the same toolbox with me. And I'm adding to that toolbox as I go. Year by year, I'm adding more terms, maybe more sophisticated terms, maybe more complex terms, but I'm always still dealing with tools that I'm comfortable with. I've got my hammer, I've got my saw, I've got my nails. These are tried and true, and I've been using them since I was a little kid, and I can continue to use them on this literature. So I think it's good for both kids and for moms to have that consistency. And it's also really great, I think, for you as a teacher. This is one set of terms. This is one set of tools. There are a fair number of them, but once you got these, that's it. You know, there's nothing else, no matter how many children you have, for the whole 12 years that each of them will be educated at home, that's it. I don't know about you, but I find that very, very comforting. So that's great. The other thing is that you don't have to do everything all at once. You're not understanding, evaluating, and enjoying on all levels all the time. Let's say you have a lower grammar student and an upper grammar student and a dialectic student. Okay, your lower grammar student, if you go ahead and look at this slide with the chart, your lower grammar student, the emphasis for them falls on enjoyment. So if you look in the upper left hand here, the understand, evaluate, enjoy row for the lower grammar column, the emphasis for them falls on enjoyment. We just really want them to enjoy what they're reading. And we want to start to work on them understanding, but in a very small way. So we may say to them, honey, this is a setting. A setting means it's a place where the story goes on. I say, oh, okay, and they probably won't get it, and that's fine, because guess what? Next year you'll come back around and you'll teach them setting again. So you don't really have to worry too much about them getting it year to year to year, so long as they are improving consistently. Then if you bump over a box to the upper grammar, emphasis is still on enjoyment, but there's more emphasis now on understanding. So you may say, honey, this is a setting. It's the place where the story happens. And also there are different kinds of settings. There's something called a temporal setting, which is the time when it happens. And then there's something called a physical setting, which is the place where it happens. And then there's something called a cultural setting, which is the culture in which it happens. So you can say, honey, when you have the story of the Pharisee and the tax collector, well, it says they're in the temple, which is a place, that's a physical setting, and it doesn't say what time of day or night it is, so we don't have a temporal setting, but we kind of do because we know it's in ancient times. So that's the time setting. It's in ancient times in this place, the temple, and you say the culture is ancient Hebrew culture. And in ancient Hebrew culture, honey, a tax collector wouldn't even be allowed to come into the temple, and that's why it's significant that the tax collector stands outside in the courts, whereas a Pharisee is a guy who really knows the law, and he would have been allowed into the more inward courts of the temple. So that's why you have the tax collector standing outside and the Pharisee standing inside. And that's what the settings are. That's how the settings are going on in the story. So you might explain that to your upper grammar student. At the dialectic level, there is more and more emphasis on understanding. Enjoyment is still important. Enjoyment is always important. Please don't ever think that enjoyment isn't important. It is. But more and more as they get older, I think the enjoyment comes from them really understanding and really getting what they're reading, and they're being able to evaluate it biblically. I think that as students get older and more sophisticated in their pleasures become much more the pleasure of getting it than just the simple childhood pleasure of, oh, this guy found a puppy in the street and took it home. It's a different kind of pleasure. So that's the dialectic level, and also at the dialectic level, you're starting to work on evaluation. So you step back and you say, okay, biblically speaking, here's the Pharisee, here's the tax collector. Which of their experiments in living is the one that we ought to follow, and why? So that whole, I explained to you a little while ago, the Pharisee's experiment living and its result. He wasn't justified before God. Tax collector, different result. You start to make connections for them. You start to say, okay, well, what does that tell us, biblically speaking, about this? And that's the dialectic level. And then rhetoric, it's just, full on understand, evaluate, enjoy. So, and we never assume, by the way, that coming into the rhetoric level, your student has had previous experience with Tapestry literature. So it's not like if you come into Tapestry at 9th grade, your student has to go back and do all the lower levels work in order to get the rhetoric level. That's not the case. Every year with rhetoric, we split every year into 2 levels, beginning and continuing. So if your student is a beginning student, that means that this is their first year with rhetoric level literature, and it will teach them all the terms, all the concepts, all the tools as if they had never seen it before in their lives. Continuing level is for students who have had at least 1 year of rhetoric tapestry literature. So this means they're a little more acclimated, they understand some of the vocabulary, they understand some of the tools, and they're able to start moving on from there. So continuing level is always more sophisticated, but we always have beginning level in there because we know that sometimes you have students who just come into Tapestry in high school, or even if you have students who have been in Tapestry from the beginning, they still need to make the jump. So, if you look down the next row at reading, starting again with the lower grammar in the far left column, picture books, read aloud books, historical fiction, some very simple children's versions of adult classics, like, instead of the Odyssey, they do the story of Odysseus or something like that, and then children's classics, like, The Runaway Bunny or Goodnight Moon or whatever might be appropriate. So really, again, simply wanting them to enjoy and to perhaps begin to build an imagination. Upper grammar, you'll see we're now into chapter books, and this is where historical fiction comes in very big, I would say, especially at the upper grammar and dialectic levels, because this is where it's a really good filler for places where there isn't classic children's literature and they aren't ready for the great books, but there is some really, really beautifully written historical fiction out there that they can practice, understand, evaluate, and enjoy on, and that also ties into their history really well. So, chapter books, historical fiction, some children's versions of adult classics. Again, now maybe you've graduated from the story of Odysseus to Tales from the Odyssey or something like that. And then, children's classics where there are any. Dialectic, same kind of thing. More historical fiction, more children's classics, young adult classics. Example would be maybe something like Tom Sawyer, or let's stick with Tom Sawyer. Tom Sawyer is not really quite appropriate for upper grammar unless you have a very strong reader, but it's definitely too easy for rhetoric. At a rhetoric level, you would read more, Huckleberry Finn or something like that, which is a more adult book. So books like that are young adult classics come in. Some adult classics are suitable for young adolescents, we think. That's always a dicey call to make. But we do include, sometimes Sherlock Holmes stories or things like that, things that were written for adults, but the dialectic can genuinely enjoy. A lot of short stories often will work that way, or sometimes something like The Red Badge of Courage will work for a dialectic level. And then obviously at the rhetoric level you have the great books, the adult classics, which some young rhetorics are not ready to handle. I have 14-year-olds who I would hesitate to start on something like All Quiet on the Western Front or Kafka's Metamorphosis. On the other hand, usually by the time you hit 16, most of the stuff in there is stuff that most students are ready to handle. I find that 16 is where they have kind of made the transition to the more adult reading level. So, though always you have to weigh as a parent, as a teacher, where's my student's maturity level, their faith in God. I mean, I have to tell you, when I was 18 years old and taking Year 4 literature for the first time, it really shook me. It really, really shook me. All Quiet on the Western Front was a very hard book for me to read, and I really questioned God's goodness as a result. But it was also wonderful because going through that process of having to ask myself whether I really believe that God is good in the face of hard stuff like World War I, and this soldier's terrible experiences with World War I, which is what All Quiet on the Western Front is about, really taught me a lot about choosing to trust God even when I don't understand. So I'm not saying it's not valuable. It can be incredibly valuable. It's just that you do have to think about, is my student ready for this? And you have to ask the Holy Spirit and say, Lord, is he ready for this? So, okay, moving down to the next row, thinking row, you'll observe lower grammar, upper grammar, lots of workbook pages. Again, mostly reading comprehension. Did you get what was going on in the story? Did you get the plot? Some little literary analysis exercises, not much at all, just a little bit. Minimal discussion, you just check workbook pages, make sure your student understands, maybe talk to them a little bit about it. Dialectic, more of the starting to have discussions, starting to talk about things, starting to make connections. Especially as Tapestry is currently written, you'll see that in years 3 and 4 more and more. Years 1 and 2 are still pretty much just workbook pages, so that's just as Tapestry is currently written, that's the way it is. At the rhetoric level, you have discussion questions, you have literary analysis exercises, and you have discussions with teachers. We don't do accountability questions in literature at the rhetoric level because I always kind of figure that either they read it or they didn't. And as the mom, you know whether they read it or not because you live in the same house with them. And if they didn't read it, that will very quickly become apparent during your discussion. And so I've never felt the need to ask my student, what did so-and-so say in conversation X in chapter Y? So I don't feel that's important. I'd much rather have them spend the time on literary analysis exercises, which is great because that's where you take concepts like, all right, this week we're going to talk about irony. Find me some examples of irony in this book. And the way I organize class plans as I write them, I teach whatever concepts I can teach using the book. So in other words, if I have a book that's very heavy on irony, that's very satirical perhaps, or gets in a lot of contrast, artistic contrast, then I will teach those concepts, satire and artistic contrast and irony, in that week because I have a book that really exemplifies them well. So that's kind of the way we do that. And just so you know, in rhetoric level, your students basically get the same concepts every year. And the reason for that is it really does take about 4 years to really get it down, all the different terms and tools and concepts. But the nice thing about them, virtually all of the important ones repeating every year, is that if you miss it, you don't quite get it, you don't quite understand it in 1 year, that's okay. You can come back to it in another. And yet at the same time, these tools and terms are so universal and so applicable to literature, and there's so much meat to be gotten out of using them on literature that it never gets boring. So that's a really neat thing too. Irony, you can teach it 4 times in 4 years, and every time you'll still get something out of it. It won't be like, okay, ho-hum, old hat. You will get to the point, hopefully, where your student has memorized the definition of irony, but you should not get to the point where there's just nothing to talk about, because they wouldn't be going over the term irony unless it applied to the book that they were reading, and therefore they could talk about the way that this particular book uses irony and what's cool about that. So, and then next is writing. And again, the lower levels we just don't do literature-specific writing. Just don't do that. At the upper level, you can see there are several different papers, and those are all explained in writing aids, explained in teaching rhetoric literature, so I won't get into them very much. And then finally, there's testing. And again, at the lower levels, not a lot of testing because there aren't a lot of terms and tools that we're teaching them at those levels. But at the upper level, you do get full-blown unit exams with vocabulary tests and everything. So anyway, that pretty much concludes our third section. And our time is almost up here, so I'd like to end this talk by reading to you the end of Macefield's poem, which just comes down to a note of quiet, peace, and satisfaction, which is what I hope will be your experience at the end of your school year. He says, I must go down to the sea again, to the vagrant gypsy life, to the gull's way and the whale's way, where the wind's like a whetted knife. And all I ask is a merry yarn from a laughing fellow rover, and quiet sleep and a sweet dream when the long trick's over. In nautical terms, a trick is the amount of time allotted to each man to stand at the helm and steer the ship. At the other end of this voyage, I really hope you'll have merry yarns to tell and hear about how God's grace met your student and you during your 9 months stand at the helm of literary studies. And finally, may you find quiet sleep and a sweet summer's dream when the long trick is over.